Hi, folks. Thanks for making it to this fifth open house on the DEPA training cycle framework that we have. So I have with me a couple of other volunteers from iSpirit and two of our Wave Zero partners. So in this open house, we will have a very candid discussion around DEPA, what it entails for our Wave Zero partners, the TSPs, the TDPs. And we'll also hear from our Wave Zero partners as to what they're seeing when they go out to market and talk to other players in the ecosystem. So before we start, I'll quickly introduce myself and then we'll go around the room and get introductions from everyone. I'm Vikram. I'm an iSpirit volunteer and also an entrepreneur. I'm the founder of Needle.ai. So with that, maybe let's go around the room. Varun, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Vikram. I'm Varun. I'm founder of Peridata. We are actually building a platform for data-rich companies like, let's say, healthcare institutions, financial institutions to actually be able to share their data in a compliant manner with their business partners for either AI modeling or data science modeling, whichever they want to. We are absolutely building this on top of the new framework, Vikram, that you talked about.
Wonderful.
So yeah, over to you, Sandeep.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandeep. I'm co-founder CTO for ProFintech. As ProFintech, we are trying to enable MSMEs across India with simple and affordable trade finance opportunities. And we are very interested in DPDP and DEPA technological framework to understand how we can build our models with the help of existing institutions that can help us with the data that we can then use for training our models.
Thanks, Sandeep. Dr. Sham?
Yeah, hi. I'm part of the iSpirit volunteer framework and also been part of the DEPA framework for a while now. It's part of the first implementation.
Wonderful, thanks. And Hari?
Hello, everybody. My name is Hari Subramanian. I'm an iSpirit volunteer in the DEPA and the data privacy initiatives. Also an entrepreneur of a company called Niti.ai.
Thanks, folks. So I think we look forward to a very engaging discussion today. For folks who haven't seen the earlier open houses, I'll sort of walk you through quickly a few slides. I won't go into too much detail, but there is a slew of three-letter acronyms. I want to make sure everybody's on the same page on what those acronyms mean. And after that, we will open the floor for questions, and we'll have a very engaging interaction on what DEPA means for the Wave Zero partners and what they're seeing as they go out into market. Okay, so with that, let me quickly share my screen. So this is, so I think we are all familiar with the first iteration of DEPA, which is the DEPA inference cycle. And a lot of the DPDP Act and framework is built around this, which essentially implies that when a user needs to share information with a data consumer, it has to happen via consent from the user. So this concept called a consent manager was introduced so that if a data provider had to share the information of a user who was a user on that particular provider's platform, it had to go via a consent manager. And this would be used by the data consumers at inference time. And this would be used to sort of serve up, it could be advertising models, it could be to monitor fraud, risk evaluation, making lending decisions, all kinds of things, right? But while this talks about the inference cycle, this does not talk about how these black boxes, which are essentially about training of these models, happens. And most importantly, if you need to train all these models, you need to unlock the power of a host of data that is available and locked within enterprises without the risk of leaking private information, right? So there are a couple of use cases that I will talk about here, but there are a host of other use cases that can get unlocked with this. We'll talk primarily about two use cases, one in the financial services space and one in the medical research space. In the financial services space, as we mentioned earlier, this kind of model building can be used by financial startups who get data that's today locked within banks to write far better underwriting models to enable lending at lower cost with lower risk to the populace at large. And it can also be used for fraud detection. Second is for medical research purposes. There is a lot of health data that's locked within, hospitals, diagnostics, labs, etc. How do you unlock the value of all of this information for the purpose of medical research without the risk of leaking private information about individuals, right? And this is what DEPA for training unlocks. So there are three players in this ecosystem: the citizens, you and me, who are worried about data privacy because we are leaving a large digital footprint today across a variety of services that we consume, be it in the financial services, healthcare, just consuming, other kinds of web sources, etc. Second are the data providers. These could be, banks, insurance providers, healthcare providers like hospitals, etc., who have a lot of very valuable data locked within them, but do not necessarily have the expertise themselves to unlock the value of this data. And there is no incentive today because there are very asymmetric risks. If this information is provided to a data consumer or a modeler, if any information leaks as a consequence, the loss of reputation or any legal risks that come as a consequence are huge. And the third are the enterprises or the small startups that are, like some of the folks that are represented here, who want to compete against big tech. Today, big tech has a monopoly on innovation in the AI and modeling space, and have access to data in-house. How do these smaller enterprises sort of innovate against these data that is in silos and locked across various enterprises today without the worry of, going through huge legal frameworks, cost for engaging with these data providers and getting easy access to all of this information? The main challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is data's locked up in silos, and there are asymmetric risks and benefits for the data providers. And this is what we aim to unlock. And the way we unlock this is by providing a techno-legal framework, which has three aspects to it. One, we want to enable the modeling phase so that a training data provider in this case could be a healthcare provider, it could be insurance firm, etc., to provide information securely to a training data consumer, like some of the startups represented here, so that the modeling can happen in a fashion that does not leak privacy. In addition, we want to provide a legal framework so that there are no asymmetric risks or there are no undue risks for the training data provider to provide this information. And in case of any breaches, there is quick resolution to this, right? So there are three pillars to how we enable this. One is this what we call a confidential computing infrastructure or framework. Second are electronic contracts, which are contracts between the training data provider and the training data consumer, so that at low cost they can enter into agreements for data sharing and have enforceable contracts very easily. And the third aspect is we want to use something called differential privacy, which ensures that not only there are no data leaks at the base, at a core level, but also the models themselves cannot leak information about individuals, right? So these are the three pillars to what we have built. And to bring this marketplace into play, we need multiple players coming together. One is the training data provider, where all this valuable information is locked. Second is the training data consumer, who are the small enterprises who want to bring their AI and modeling chops to bear on all of this data and unlock the value. Third are what we call the training service providers and discovery agents. So the training service providers are essentially sort of people who provide this framework and enable matchmaking between the training data providers and the training data consumers. And it is possible that we have a discovery agent which allows for the training data consumer to discover what data sets are available from the training data providers. And finally, in order to sort of regulate and set the rules for the game or frameworks by which all these players in the ecosystem will come together, we will have a self-regulatory organization which brings together players from the TDPs, TDCs, and TSPs and sets the rules for the game for how they should function in a fair and efficient manner. So I will pause here and I'll now open the floor and happy to take questions. I know there are a whole bunch of questions that we have from the Wave Zero partners here. So Sandeep, maybe you want to go first.
Thanks, Vikram. Yeah, definitely a lot of interesting questions have come up in our initial conversations and later on followed up with more deeper questions. One of the questions that we get asked from the partners that we are seeking out help with the training data right now is that do I have to publish metadata about the data that I have, the data catalog? Do I have to publish it publicly? I don't want to grab unnecessary attention from third parties or unrelated parties like hackers, for example.
Right. Sure. Maybe Dr. Sham, you want to take a crack at that question first?
Sure. No, I think, Sandeep, good question. And I think the first thing is, I think there is no necessity for this data dictionary and things like that to be published publicly. The ideal way that we see this to be done is to be done through the help of a discovery agent. And so through that kind of a very kind of a more secure mechanism, you can access critical aspects of the data set, particularly on the metadata and things like that. But however, it's never going to be put out as a public information. So I think that would be the answer to your specific question.
Got it.
So,
yeah. So just to add to that, I think the data itself is going to be end-to-end encrypted, right? So between the TDP and the TDCs, and the TDPs get to control the keys for decryption, and at runtime the keys get vended out through a contract service, which is part of the architecture. So when implemented, the entire architecture makes sure that the data pipes, end-to-end data pipes between the TDP and the TDC are completely transparent to the data. The data is only interpreted by the algorithms that are meant to see the data, and there is an entire compute infrastructure guarantee for that as well. And so the data catalog essentially, not neither the data catalog nor the data is actually seen by anyone. But for the purposes of training the data, there are special provisions for anonymized data sets to be shared so that somebody could build a model that using the training data set and then using that sample data, and then further training can happen using the CCR infrastructure, using the where the data is never seen by any eyes, right? Human eyes.
Right.
I think to add on to Hari's point, I think it's essential to understand that typically, and again, this is not mandated. Okay, just to add. The discovery agent is ideally one of the mechanisms, but it also doesn't mean that everything is mandatorily to be done that way as well. So I think as the specifications evolve and things like that, so it's not a hard and fast rule that it has to be only through this. The other thing also, I think that Hari kind of brought out is the data catalog is nothing but just giving you an idea of what the data set is. But you could also explore other mechanisms like sample data or synthetic data that can be provided, which enables modelers to kind of understand the kinds of data. So I think these are slightly more than what you asked, Sandeep, but I think this gives you the flavor of plus.
Yeah, thanks. So I think great answers, and I think I think the main point is that the discovery agent is not necessarily a part of this. It's an enabler for data discovery, but it's not mandated. And I think Hari and Dr. Sham had great answers there as to how this can be enabled. So with that, maybe the follow-up question. Any follow-up questions, or Varun, you have something to ask as a
Yeah, I think one follow-up to that, Vikram, could be, so one part of it is discovery, right? Data discovery, as you said, that it will be by invite publicly. If the data provider wants, then they
Yeah.
can show it publicly. If not, then they won't have that. They had the end-to-end control. But the next part, next question that we get often is that any transaction that is done through this framework, right? Data transaction that is done through this framework, does that automatically mean that they get a DPDP compliance certification? Or is there something else that needs to be added on top of it to get that certification?
Yeah, I think that's again a fantastic question. So maybe I'll let Hari. Hari, do you want to take that question?
Sure. Let me try to take a crack at it, and maybe I'll draw a parallel here, right, to how the evolution of similar certifications happened in the DEPA. So DEPA has two phases: inference and training. We are now talking about the pilot for the DEPA training phase, where you're able to get data sets from a data provider, train models, and then inference actually essentially means that you have already gotten the data, right? And largely in many cases, if this was data sharing was not happening, these data sets were already proprietary data sets, and therefore you're, for inference purposes, at runtime, getting a copy of the data or the golden copy of the data directly from the data principal or the user or the consumer to perhaps underwrite a loan, right, in that case. And the biggest use case there that is implemented in the DEPA training phase is DEPA inference phase is the account aggregator system in India. So if you sort of trace back how the evolution of certifications happened in the account aggregator framework,
Hey,
sort of,
Hari, sorry to interrupt. Do you want me to flash a slide on, how the whole
yeah,
DEPA inference happened? That might just sort of help people understand
absolutely.
how some of these things work.
Absolutely. This is a great slide. Yes, yes. So again, what we're seeing here is sort of um, the DEPA inference modeling, and we sort of talk about purpose limitation, which is yet to come, right? And we talk about the evolution of DEPA architecture across these broad phases. DEPA inference, which is the account aggregator, sort of launched in 2017. With 2018, a whole bunch of AA applicants starting, and then Sahamati, which is the collective of account aggregators, came about in 2019, right? Then we sort of had the certification process for FIUs, FIPs, and the account aggregators that launched roughly in this particular case, 2-3 years after when the initial sort of launch happened. And what it really sort of speaks to is the early entrants really are the ones that are also helping formulate and see a lot of the problems and help formulate the regulations. So in this case, Sahamati was a collective. The account aggregators themselves are these organizations recognized by the regulators as the NBFC AAs, right? So they are the ones that are actually regulated. The spec that was actually part of DEPA inference, which is now called the Rebit specs, right? And then any implementation of the account aggregator to the Rebit spec, it is what is validated by any of the empaneled. I think there are 3 or 4 empaneled certifiers today for the DEPA inference phase. They essentially validate the implementation of any account aggregator, and they certify that the account aggregator is able to now do business and allow FIUs and FIPs to exchange data for inference purposes. Similarly, like if you just apply that sort of same timeline, I'm not sure if the timeline applies, but at least definitely the learnings will apply, right? So we are sort of in that 2017 equivalent phase of launching of the DEPA for modeling, for model training. The initial sort of TSPs, TDPs, and TDCs that come into this sort of initiative are the ones that will help truly formulate the learnings, and then the next step is going to be creation of an SRO, which will monitor the compliance requirements and the compliance requirements of the TDPs and the TDCs, right? And therefore ensure traceability of data. There is a lot of evolving challenges around AI model traceability and responsible AI, which sort of the governance policies will be formulated with the help of the SRO, and then once recognized by the right government body, should be developing the right sort of standards for compliance. And similar to how the compliance standards for DEPA for inference evolved over the first couple of years, we would anticipate that similarly the requirements and the compliance certification related to DEPA modeling will also evolve, right, as the project unfolds.
So that's a great answer. And so Hari, do you think, in your opinion, do you think there's a playbook that we now have for doing the DEPA training kind of evolution that goes from, I think we are barely at launch, we're probably at 2017 right now for DEPA training. But in your opinion, we have a playbook that will sort of describe how we go from step to step in getting to the place where we have certification, right? I think the next evolution is the Wave Zero partners. I think we still don't, we're still forming the cohort of Wave Zero partners, then formation of the SRO. Hopefully we can apply the learnings that we've had from all those places. And then will come the certification or the compliance piece of it, right? And hopefully we have a playbook in place right now.
Correct. I think we have a playbook in place. In fact, I mean, I wasn't part of DEPA back in 2017, so I'm not sure if Dr. Shyam or someone was. But from my recollection, right, a lot of the learnings from the playbook are things that we have sort of already implemented. For instance, a lot of the DEPA training sort of has picked up pace since the signing of the DPDP bill itself last year. And so I think sort of the bill itself is what I see as the cornerstone of what the law sort of says about privacy. And the coming into effect of the bill really sets in the urgency for having a thorough process for data sharing, right, which today does not exist. And we know that the Ministry of Information Technology is yet to come out with specific standard operating procedures for data fiduciaries for how they should handle data. And I think we are already, I mean, we probably are a little bit ahead of this curve from sort of how I see 2017 to 2020 panned out to how we are now sort of evolve in the evolution of DEPA for modeling. I think some of the ingredients are already in place, and we might get to the certification process faster than sort of the DEPA inference cycle.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hari. Dr. Shyam, do you have anything to add, or we could go to the next question?
Yeah, I think we can go to the next question. I think that should be fine. Yes.
Great.
Vikram, just as an addition to this, I know you talked about there being a playbook of practices, standard practices, right? So within that, could you also talk about contract execution work? I mean, how easy or difficult will it be to define a contract, to handle exceptions? Because electronic contract is a big part of enablement, right?
Yeah, fantastic question. So maybe Dr. Shyam here is the one who's sort of implemented the whole 9 yards of our initial reference implementation. So I'll let him answer that. I think he's, go ahead, Dr. Shyam.
Sure. So, Varun, I think a couple of things. First, to carry on what Vikram just showed on the kind of the roadmap and how things are. I think the reference implementations and the work that's going to come out as a part of the Wave Zero implementation effort is going to drive a lot of real ground understanding of what's going to happen as you start approaching the various certifications that you need to work towards. Okay, that space is fairly well defined, I would say. Of course, there are certain new guidelines and all that's working out, but I think from a technology perspective, the framework here is trying to address the critical components of it. So like if you look at things like the differential privacy, if you look at confidential compute, and then the contract, the electronic contracts, I think these 3 or 4 critical pillars are all giving you the foundational elements of how you can build these infrastructure, number one. The second piece of it is to make this a very robust process. You want to kind of keep it as electronic as possible in the life cycle. Now, as you have seen in the ecosystem players, you have 3 or 4 critical ecosystem players in this. Now, to ensure that this is done in an efficient way, the electronic contracts will play a critical role, because you're able to, one, of course, machine readable, but also it makes it very precise. Now, once it becomes machine readable, and then also since if you look at the framework and the implementation that we have, it becomes easier to process end to end, all the way from building the pipelines, running the privacy preserving processes, giving the outputs, all in a very contractually binding way. And there are 2 sides, there are many parts of the contract. One is also the technical side of the contract, and then there are other fragments of the contract which are the commercials and so on. So I think the electronic contracting part of it addresses all aspects of it, including the payments, the commercial elements of it, along with the data side of it, along with the modeling side of it. So in a sense, it's composite, and at the same time, it is also granular, and it gives us a flexibility to build on this. Arun, is that giving you a better perspective?
Yeah, Dr. Sham, I think that helps. I think at least that puts in perspective that what is a contract solving for and what are the features for it. That helps, yes.
Yeah. So if to go slightly L2 level, because many of you are startups and technical, the contract even will capture elements like, for example, what are your privacy configurations?
Right.
What are the thresholds? Okay. So that kind of transparency allows you to also be very clear when you sign up these kind of engagements, how to work through the process. And the framework also allows you to check and see whether you're within the bounds of that process or within those thresholds. So if you bust it, then it stops. So as this platform evolves, a lot more controls can be put in because of the power of these electronic contracts.
Electronic contracts, correct. No, I think one of the major, at least questions that we are getting when we are going out and talking to people, Dr. Sham, is also that how will you limit the usage of data, right? How will you do a limitation on that? And I think the electronic contracts help there because of the specific purpose limitation part that we have, right? So that sort of gives confidence to the data provider or data fiduciary in this scenario that was okay. If there is a violation apart from this purpose, then I can actually trace that back and track that back. So I think the electronic contracts that way helps captures a lot of corner cases.
Do you have time for an interesting story? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Sham.
Yeah, no, I think perfectly good. Just see, conversationally speaking, this is an evolving framework. So we got to always keep in mind lots of things are going to get understood, built, and so on. So as long as the components are granular, they can evolve to scale.
Right.
There's no lock-in. So I think the power is basically non-locking in and evolution. And as various things evolve, we're able to quickly connect the dots from a technical solution.
Right.
Yeah, Hari, please go ahead.
Yeah.
No, saying that definitely the electronic contracts are in place where a lot of the information on the traceability of the information is available. It's logged, and therefore a lot of the enforcement of it and identifying any exceptions and inconsistencies will come in place, right? But the interesting story that I was thinking of is that I lived for a brief period in the US in a somewhat of a questionable neighborhood, right? So we were like worried, and so we thought we'll actually put a home surveillance monitoring system, right? So it's like a video camera system. So I went on Amazon, was searching for like video camera systems, and these were probably like selling for a few $100s, right? It's anywhere ranging from $300 to $500, because there is like a camera, you have to wire it up, you have to like record it and all that stuff. And then there are these other cameras that are costing $30, $40, $50, $30, right? And I'm like puzzled. How is someone giving anything for $30, right? And then if you go just look at Amazon, I realized that it's not an actual camera. It's just a plastic, camera, fake camera, but that looks exactly like any of the brand. Even they actually match the brand. If there are popular brands in the market, they match the brand. And the camera comes with, in the US, there are these security companies that will give you like a board in front of your house that you can put, saying that it's this house is monitored by ADT. So they give the fake camera, and they also give you these fake boards. Of course, there are branding things, but it looks almost like ADT, but it's not ADT, right? So And the beautiful thing is that this company that actually sells these fake cameras on Amazon, they had an extensive research study that was posted along with the Amazon product description, that they conducted a study, and then the fake camera actually was almost as effective as the real camera in thwarting that a potential sort of person to come and intrude in the house, right? Because when the biggest benefit of the camera is that there are a dozen houses, the person who is actually coming and trying to intrude is going to go after the weakest link where there is nothing, right? So they have a fraction of a second probably to make a decision to whether to stop in front of your house and go after it. And the mere existence of a camera is enough to safeguard. That's the biggest safeguard. The actual whether the camera works or at all is irrelevant. So similarly, I think the very existence of the electronic contracts itself is a huge sort of benefit to the system, because now you have the benefit of somebody that where the data lineage and sort of all other aspects of that data electronic contracts is beneficial in enforcing the right behavior, right? And of course, whether we you can always implement more things as we find problems, but the mere existence of electronic contracts is the biggest win.
Interestingly, Hari, I was just having a conversation with my neighbor who's on our whatever resident association management company, and he suggested to me exactly the same solution that you're saying for some security reasons. But having said that, Hari, so I think one aspect is, I think, the existence of an electronic contract, but as a barrier to deter bad behavior.
Right.
But I think the other aspect that we have been discussing also is, the whole aspect of logging and auditability, and that every aspect is a digital trail, right? So I think you had this interesting point earlier about how compliance, etc., becomes simpler because the whole 9 yards from start to end is a digital trail and is entirely logged. Maybe you can sort of just elaborate on that a little bit.
Absolutely. No, I think in India, particularly in countries in India and in countries like India, having just the legal aspect of something is sort of insufficient, and in most cases it's next to useless, because if you don't have enforceability, if you don't have a strong legal system to go after and sort of get remediation to any loss that comes from it, then the law is sort of useless, right? So this is sort of where a lot of the DPI stack in India, or the India stack, or the citizen stack as we are starting to call it, comes with digital enforcement as a parallel to the law itself, right? So we have what is the policy, but then how can we really enforce that? And that's where building from the scratch, from ground up, as we are building systems where we have foolproof digital enforcement of what the policy is, very critical. I think in this case, this is also, a responsible AI and this particular topic is an evolving topic, right, world over. And I think we have the DPA stack, I think, is doing some pioneering work in electronic contracts, and some of the stuff that we have also been since then thinking about in terms of traceability chains, right, which really talks about both the actual contract that exists and what data was exchanged, therefore, and the pricing and all of that stuff being logged, so it's auditable, but also more data lineage, right? Where did this data actually come from? Who produced that data set, right? All of that also becomes very critical in terms of not just the where the data came from, but also in terms of you want to now look at the quality of the data that and the model that it produces, whether these models, or whether if they are producing any harm to the society, then we go back and trace the quality of data. And because from the models, right, these are interesting and very evolving sort of technological challenges globally. And it's amazing that sort of we have some of these frameworks in place that are ready to evolve, right, as the time progresses.
Thanks, Hari.
Right.
I think Dr. Sam, you have something to add?
Yeah, I think this is the other see, today we've taken a lot of use cases of many of them in the private sector. But if you wanted to really look at large use cases, and you want to look at continental scale data sets, I think frameworks like these will start playing a critical role. Let it be healthcare, let it be other critical domains. But if you look at healthcare, the COVID example that we have taken as a part of the implementation is a classic example of real world challenges and how frameworks like this and its implementation can actually enable you to rapidly scale. Because if you don't get the tech right, you can't scale. So getting the tech right, I think, is probably the most critical part of the puzzle. So while we talk about it, one of the words that gets sometimes continental scale. How do you build for super large use cases? So yeah.
Correct. And as long as we are on contracts also, so Vikram, the electronic contract, are they enforceable in the Indian Penal Code? Is there, do we have a legal answer on that?
Yes, yes. So we have a legal answer on that. So electronic contracts are enforceable in the Indian scheme of things. Smart contracts are not. There's a lot of uncertainty about that and questions around that. But electronic contracts are enforceable, which is why consciously we have chosen to implement this. If you look at the three pillars, we have called one of them as electronic contracts and not smart contracts. So these are enforceable in the courts.
Correct. And any dispute, I mean, any variation from the contract it gives a clear answer on who is the aggrieved party and who is the
Yes.
defaulter.
Yeah. Any other questions, Sandeep?
I guess just a segue to some of the other things that we have been looking at, Vikram, is while DEPA for inference is already in place for the finance domain, and it has been reasonably well understood and very highly successful in the form of account aggregator and Sahimati. There are a few domains that are starts like NDHM for health, but how do we really look at DEPA for training and DEPA for inference also across all the verticals, across all the industries, the geographies like India have and also beyond?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I think your question is, will the SROs, TDPs, TDCs, etc. be the same? Will there be one single SRO? Will there be multiple SROs, right? I think we have been talking about this, and the short answer is I don't know, but I mean, we don't know how it's going to evolve. That's the short answer. But I will let the other folks here take a crack at. I know there are differing perspectives on this, so I'd love to hear the differing perspectives on this. So, Dr. Sham, maybe you go first.
Yeah. See, I think my personal view is there will be a lot of domain-specific SROs. Okay, because of the nature of complexity. Okay, healthcare has its own nuances. Every domain has its own nuances. So in a logical sense, I think the SRO will have to play a lot of domain-specific role. Now, in that domain specificity, because we're dealing with multiple kinds of technologies over here, there will be a lot of specificity that will come by way of those three pillars that we're talking about. Okay, right now we have a reference implementation. As things start getting implemented, I think a lot more refinement and structure will come in the way the SROs will build it out. Okay, I think because, again, I go back, I'm repeating it again, but because of the granularity in the way we are constructing the framework, I think it will be easier for the SROs to start defining domain-specific approaches to solving this. Some will be standards, some could be certifications, some could be checklists, and so on and so forth. So there will be a whole slew of things that will come in as a part of this.
Cool. Hari, I suspect you have a different answer. So
yeah, I have a slightly different answer, and I think it's a mix of. I think reality is going to be a mix of what Dr. Sham's saying, but also the opposite of what he's saying, right? And maybe I'll take a minute to sort of, and we are all to some extent surmising this, right? If you go back to looking at DEPA for inference, we sort of started that primarily for the financial services domain, right? So there, the data sharing happens primarily between a financial information provider and a financial information user. Both typically are financial institutions. One is, say, your bank. Another is, say, a lender that is trying to maybe perhaps underwrite you for a loan. And instead of what account aggregator replaces, is it replaces the physical process of you getting a bank statement, going to a physical branch, getting it authorized, and then submitting it to another bank, only to be digitized, and then it goes back for validation. And then, like, it just, yeah, it takes much longer, and it's much more expensive, right? And this sort of simplifies the data sharing in this case between these two institutions. And even if you look there are three regulators or four regulators. So there is RBI, there is SEBI from a securities perspective, there is IRDA, and then there is PFRDA, right? So there are four different regulators, and sort of some of the challenges that we have seen with account aggregator, as it matures, as it gains scale, right? Of course, account aggregator has solved a lot of problems. It has, really, if you talk to people in this space, they tell that account aggregators like almost eliminated fraud, right? In this case, because now data directly comes from the bank, and therefore it sort of eliminated fraud. So while it's derived a lot of benefits already, I think some of its challenges and the headwinds are also related to having multiple regulators, right? Because it's very hard for you to get anything by one regulator, and talk about having four regulators having to agree to something. I think in contrast to sort of DEPA for inference, I think DEPA for training and most of these AI and ML use cases, I think we have always talked about these complex adaptive systems as a reference architecture for how to think about AI, right? So, and without going into the details, maybe we can post a link to the paper about complex adaptive systems, which is a great paper to read for people. But the gist of that story, of the concept of the paper, is that it's just better to keep things simple, right? And then that may be the best approach for some of these complex adaptive systems when you're trying to model them and regulate them. And with that thinking, I think the DEPA for training probably will benefit from a much simpler approach to sort of regulation, where it's not multiple regulators. And this is also true because training data set sharing is not specific to financial data. It is for very different types of data sets. So I think the extent to which the regulations that come out are fairly broad and simple will help for the adoption to actually happen. Right. So my hope is that it's actually not very domain specific, but it's like one simple sort of regulations that the Ministry of Information Technology comes up with, that most data fiduciaries can sort of adopt, right?
Yeah.
And there is some precedence to it, like GDPR, I think, is a precedence to it. Perhaps not the best example of implementation, but there is some precedence to having single regulation.
So I agree, Hari. I think my personal bias is exactly what you're saying. I think simplicity is always trumps. Simplicity helps with evolution and building all kinds of complexity. I mean, whatever complex scenarios, if you build out of simple base models out of it, that's one thing. I think the second piece I see is, I can always we can also, because we have so much digital traceability and auditability in the system, you can actually think of, in my opinion, for any sort of nuanced compliance issue that you need to bring on top of it, it should just be a software layer on top of this, all these logs and traceability that you have, right? It's just a way of enforcing that. So the SRO should be, in my opinion, I agree with Hari, it should be as simple as possible. Ensure there's enough auditability, traceability. And if you have that, then, each each vertical can slice and dice those digital logs in a way that makes sense for that particular vertical. I think that's a better way of evolving this than having, multiple players coming into play. That's my personal bias, but who knows how.
No, I think one more way, at least that we are seeing in the market, and at least we feel is, Vikram, on the same lines, that there can be a central SRO right, which sets out some basic guidelines both for regulated industries and non-regulated industries. For regulated industries, then you can have your individual SROs. For example, in the financial system, you have this Sanity. There will be similarly for health tech. For non-regulated industry, you don't actually need that, right? For example, for ad tech, for other e-commerce industries, you don't really need a sector-specific SRO.
So the sort of the regulated industry, the baby SRO can be a very light layer over the base.
Right.
You don't need anything complex out there.
See, a classic example, I can take an example is if you took a look at NIST in the US. It's a very I would say knowledgeable body, and there are many such bodies. They publish very high quality suggestions, anything related to standards, technology standards. And hence, if you were to look at it, it's used as the core reference. Now, how you take it to a certain domain and how you use it is again something that can be considered. So the debate is out there. It doesn't mean this or that. It just depends on what is the best way to implement this. I think our benefit is, however, the outcome of the choice of how the SRO gets generated. I think the framework, again, I go back to our systems thinking and saying that, does the system permit you to break it down to granular components? Does it allow you to log? Does it allow you to decouple? And so on. So I think if we have the checkboxes on these, I think that outcome is comparatively easier to handle is again the point. I think it all comes back to that in a full circle.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Sandeep, any questions from you?
No, this makes perfect sense. One of the other things, again, I'm trying to switch to a different area of the conversation of this framework, is that when we have data that is text oriented, right? We have methods and means to de-identify, anonymize, and also safeguard with some randomization techniques. But when it becomes a little bit more rich content like audio, video, and other forms of content, how do we actually look at DEPA for training? And are there ways and means to control and execute differential privacy and the confidential compute? Will it support various kinds of data formats?
Sure. I think there's a precursor to your question because you alluded to de-identification. And then there is a question of whether DEPA training framework is text specific or agnostic to text. So maybe let's decouple those questions and take each one individually. So the first part is the de-identification question of it. So I think the de-identification, whether the TDP should provide de-identified data, right? So I was just talking to our resident legal volunteer, for example. And the benefit of, as per the DPDP Act, right? The benefit of sharing de-identified data is that once data is de-identified and shared, you're actually outside the legal purview of DPDP at some level, right? Because the TDP has done its due diligence and responsibility as far as sharing the data out there, right? But subsequently, if it can get re-identified, if somebody comes and does mischief and it can get re-identified, there are questions around that. We will address that, I think, later in this conversation. But I think the first part is that, and there the question is, what kind of data is de-identifiable easily, right? And clearly, textual data, rows and columns are easily de-identifiable, but we all know that image data, images, videos, etc. It's a much harder problem because what should I de-identify? The license plate, a person's face, what? I don't know, right? And how do you do that is an open question. So let's park that for the time being. The second part of the question is, is differential privacy sort of, is it specific to a certain type of, the idea of differential privacy, is it specific to a type of data or is it agnostic? So the way differential privacy works in the modeling frame is to add this stochastic noise at the time of back propagation, right? And when you're thinking about it that way, it is agnostic to what kind of data you're looking at, because once you're in machine learning land, whether it's an image, whether it is text, you're translating it into vectors. And once you're translated into vectors and you're adding noise, it doesn't matter what the original format was. So differential privacy is agnostic to format. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. It does. I mean, the way you train the model will be guided by certain practices and guidelines, including what you're just mentioning right now.
Yeah.
That there are requirements to introduce noise,
yeah,
to ensure that, irrespective of the format of the data, you will actually ensure that the privacy is assured.
Yeah.
And I understand that these are two different questions. One is about de-identification, which kind of tells that the data provider has done his due diligence, has
Yeah.
done his bit, made sure that from his point of view, he has done whatever he could. And at the time of training, of course, you are again trying to ensure with guidelines and mathematical models that, there is enough to safeguard irrespective of the type of the data.
Right.
And then just to add to your point, the technical framework is using also fairly very standard and well accepted libraries and foundations. Okay, so in that sense, we are not saying that those. So when you look at frameworks like PyTorch and TensorFlows of the kind, I think these are industry grade, high quality frameworks, and there are many more as well. So the implementations that we are kind of talking about also talks about they show you using these kind of standard frameworks. So as of now, it works out well. It's not that you can't do it unless there are certain nuances of that specific model which have to be looked into on a case-to-case basis. But the framework by itself is, I think, as Vikram put it, is agnostic to, it's just data. But there could be other nuances, like let's say, for example, you're dealing with image data, and then if you let's say introduce noise, that cause problems in the accuracy of the model. So there are questions that will come up, or there could be certain very specific aspects that we need to look at. But otherwise, I think technical frameworks is fairly well, it's a standard set that we're using or can be used, I would say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I wanted to add, while these are sort of unsolved problems, right? When we talk about multimodal data sets and the like, I also think that these are the opportunities for TSPs such as some of the people that are in this room to solve, right? Because if you zoom out and look at the broader problem, what you're trying to do is you're trying to share data sets from the TDP to the TDC with as much of the integrity of the data in place, so that the data is valuable, right? While removing any identifiable information from that data. So when you talk about either audio or when you're talking about images and video and other sort of identifiable stuff, this could just simply be maybe this is like street names and other things that you're sort of having to find and de-identify, or like it's finding such information which could trace back any sort of personal information from a multimodal data set stream. And how do you do that efficiently? How do you do that at scale? And how do you do that while preserving the value of the data set? Absolutely. Or the opportunities for the TSPs? Because if all this stuff is solved by the DPI, then there is no room for private innovation. I think the DPI stack should allow and lay down the guardrails, but allow for TSPs to come and pick niche use cases and really build the best sort of infrastructure in place so that data sharing can happen. Right? So it's a great opportunity for people coming in.
Absolutely, that's a brilliant point. I think I think there's a very important aspect of all work that iSpirit does, right? We are sort of trying to put public guardrails and public infrastructure on which a lot of innovation can happen. Our goal is to be the GPS of the world, like Sharad likes to put it, right? On which you can build a Google Maps, you can build a gazillion other things. So these are just digital guardrails and digital infrastructure on which you guys should go out there and innovate.
And I think this also segues into the fact that if you look at an SRO, see, there are a lot of these kind of nuances, and this is an evolving field. So there's a lot of research that happens. So if you search on the same topic of, let's say, X-ray images, and then how does differential privacy, does it have an impact when you apply it on these things? So there's a lot of ongoing research, and it's always evolving. Okay. So in a sense, again, this goes back to, again, domain-specific knowledge, and very specific maybe configurations and settings that will have to come in. So the SROs will have to play that role as well, because on the technical standards as well, and even sometimes on the processing, how do you process, how do you pre-process the data, and so on. So I think this again accentuates the SRO to also be a kind of a technical body as well. It's not just checklist, it's also a technical, a deep tech role. And I guess, yeah, so that's, I think, coming out very clearly as you pose that question, Sandeep.
And as a follow-up to that, then Dr. Shyam and Vikram, is there under the DPDB bill, is there then a provision for creation of some sort of a central data board, or it's lays down the guidelines, either the technical guidelines for that?
I think there's a whole. So again, I was talking to our resident legal volunteer, Vibhav Mittal. So the way redressal, etc., happens as laid down by the DPDP, right? Is there are sort of 3 steps, 3 levels of escalation that can happen. So first off, every TDP has to have a customer grievance mechanism. So if a customer comes and figures out that there's been some leakage of information, then the TDP has to provide, they can come to a grievance cell in the TDP and try to get their issue addressed, right? If it's not addressable by the TDP, then it gets escalated to something called the Data Protection Board that is getting formed as we speak, right? It's not yet in place, but is getting formed. And if it cannot get redressed even by the Data Protection Board, then it gets escalated to a tribunal. So something like an NCLAT or something like that, where the appropriate bodies can go to get their grievance redressed. So this is sort of the escalation matrix, and this is how any issues will get addressed within the framework of the DEPA training.
Correct. And Vikram, then one of the first questions that we also get in the market specifically from data providers is on the part of breach, right? Let's say, yes, there are processes in place, but let's say you were talking about de-identification, right? So in case of a breach, how does the liability shift from, let's say, a data provider to a TSP or to the data consumer? Could you, if give some more light on that?
Yeah. So I think at a broad level, the answer is nuanced, right? It's going to be on a case-by-case basis. There is no single answer to that, right? But it depends on where the breach has happened, how the breach has happened, right? So the breach could have happened because of because the TDP didn't do its part, because the TSP, maybe there was some S3 bucket misconfiguration in their confidential compute environment. That could be a breach. Third is the TDC didn't do its part in terms of either purpose limitation or how they use the model, right? They might have gone and done something else to join data at a later date and try to sort of extract private information from the model that has gone out. So this is going to be a very nuanced answer on a case-by-case basis. There is no, I don't think we have, all we can say is that there is a redressal mechanism, but there's no straightforward answer to this. And we can bring in our resident legal expert to answer those questions on a case-by-case basis.
Got it.
Any other questions?
I think, Sandeep, if you don't have one, I have one more on specifically the concept of DEPA training, right? One of the first questions that we also entertain and get is, how does the whole consent management happen, right? When you are sharing, so DEPA inference cycle was a lot about consented data sharing, right? So can you talk about how DEPA training is more of aggregated data set sharing in a consentless manner?
Sure. Hari or Dr. Shyam, do you want to take that?
Sure. I can take a crack at it, and others can chime in. So this is a great question because it sort of addresses a nuanced point of let's take, for example, there is a data provider that actually has millions of records of data, very valuable data set, right? Now, what is the purpose of DEPA for training? We are trying to do two things. We're trying to put a framework in place that allows for the value that is logged in those private data sets to be unlocked, right? Because the biggest value that we actually have as a nation is some of these private data sets, and anything that is a publicly available data set has already been indexed and there are LLMs available for it, right? The what we are sitting on top of is the valuable private data sets which we need to quickly unlock. Now, if there is a requirement that data provider needs to go back to all the million customers and they have to give their consent for the data sharing to happen, then you can imagine that it will never happen, right? So therefore, we can't have a system in place where consent is required for the purpose of unlocking the data at scale. On the other hand, we also have to make sure that the privacy of the data principles is preserved and any value that is generated from the data finds its way back to the data principle, right? Because they have in some way, shape, or form contributed to that digital data trail to be formed in first place. That's what DEPA for training is trying to do. It's trying to put that guardrail in place so that you can unlock these data sets while protecting the privacy of the data principle, right? And as well as empowering the individual, because these data sets are getting unlocked, therefore the value from that can be unlocked, and therefore some of that value can also go back to the data principle. That's the idea behind, that's the intention behind the DPI for AI framework. Now, then you start talking about how do you go about achieving that, right? How do you go about achieving, a system where you don't have to, you can preserve the privacy of the individual in a mathematically guaranteed way, where all of the potential leaks in the system where privacy could be leaked is end-to-end plugged, right from the data in transit to data at rest to when compute is actually accessing the data. How do you make sure that it's end-to-end encrypted? How do you make sure that sufficient protection is actually taken from de-identifying data, or there are runtime protection in place for when model is training on the data, that it's not over training and it's not over memorizing the data patterns, right? Which is going to also cause some sort of leak of the privacy. So all of those things is what the framework takes care of, and providing, like, just like any good security system, there are multiple sort of layers of security, right? So I think that's what the DPI for AI sort of puts in place. Because of that, the benefit is that now a TDP who wants to unlock their data set can go ahead and do that with, as long as they follow the right de-identification and the CCR infrastructure and all of that stuff, they can go ahead and unlock that data set for a model training use case to a TDC or a training data consumer without really having to get consent of the data principal, because the privacy of the individual is never leaked through the process. So yes, great question. And I think it's important to understand that, because if we have a system that requires sort of millions of consents to be acquired for data model training use cases, then we would not get anywhere with that.
So Hari, since my conversation with Vibhav is still fresh in my mind, I'll sort of tie it back to the short answer from a legal point of view, which is what he said, right? As long as the user's information or identity is de-identified, then the DPDP doesn't come into play. And if you think about the entire DEPA training framework that we're talking about, it is about de-identifying the user. And as a consequence, the consent does not have to come into play. And that's why this techno-legal framework is so powerful, because as Hari says, if we have to get 1 million consents, we are never going to unlock value of this data.
And I think I just add on so that I think it's approaching time, but I'll try to give the endpoint on this as well, that the technical framework also ensures that when you take data into the framework, into the implementation, you don't need to carry technically any information that is identifiable. Okay, that should be a golden rule. You don't need to carry it, even though it's confidential, but people just don't need it, because models just need very specific data points, and that's all that you need. So you don't need to, you need to basically make sure that you de-identify. The framework allows the data not to be visible to anybody else but the process. It comes into the secure container. The contract and the configurations of both the data and the way the privacy configurations are configured allow you to train it as per the defined thresholds. So if you meet the thresholds, it completes the training. If you don't, then it stops. And then hence the process allows you also, in a sense, to have a technical control on the whole process. And however, whichever compliance or whichever thing, you at least have now an electronic logged technical frame that permits you to view all this. I think that's the benefit of the techno-legal framework that it supports.
Thanks, Dr. Shah. We've been at it for about an hour. Are there any other questions? We are totally happy to take it.
Just one
I'm good.
quick thought that I wanted to kind of
Sure.
ask, and probably we can see if it makes sense for this forum or maybe for later conversations. The de-identification process is a very good guideline, right? TDP will do his bit to ensure that he has done everything that he can before even publishing the data and the metadata, right? Now, when we talk about tumor size or transaction amount, right, there will always be outliers, right? There will be always be outliers, and there will be, suggestions like you can use normalization techniques and make sure that, but you kind of know that if it is a transaction amount of 30 crores versus a tumor size of this in spinal column, you kind of know, or if it is a genetic marker, or if it is some kind of an outlier, it is very hard to kind of de-identify that, right?
No, that's
you leave enough information.
Yeah. No, that's a brilliant question. And actually, that's the core of differential privacy, if you think about it. The whole idea of differential privacy is, even if you remove one record from that whole data set that you have, and that record, essentially you're trying to ensure that the statistics does not dramatically change so that you can identify that individual, right? Because as you're saying, I mean, if in a land of pygmies, if there is one giant, right, the average is skewed, and you remove the giant and the average changes, you know who the giant is. And that's exactly the point of differential privacy. So what we are saying is, yeah, it's good hygiene for the TDP to do the de-identification on their end, but the differential privacy framework also guarantees de-identification. And once you have de-identification at model level, consent or DPDP aspects don't come into play. That's the key part of it.
And to add on this, Sandeep, machine learning is still machine learning. There have been lots of work done by, I'm sure, all of you as a part of the startup ecosystem. A lot of you have been working on this. So fundamental aspects of it has not changed. So let's say, for example, you started with raw data, and let's assume that you had a scenario where you are having these kinds of situations. You still have to do that bit. Okay, this is sometimes also, they have another term called as quasi identification. You could have certain variables that give you proxies, and you can figure out outliers on that. So there is still a lot of work that has to be done between the processing of data, bringing it into your model. So this also is very critical, because the TDCs, okay, they play a vital role in building this. So again, it's a full life cycle journey. When the variables, when you get your data catalog, how do you build the model? So that science still has not changed. Yes, one more protection that comes in as you apply techniques like differential privacy. You ensure that you have a sampling where you remove a record, and hence the distribution is not impacted, and then your model would potentially behave the right way. But there is a lot of work to be done in traditional world as well before you bring it in. I am just trying to bring that flavor in, because this is also the innovation and the effectiveness of the modeler. Because that's also a critical ecosystem that the Wave Zero partners are a part of.
Cool. Thanks, Dr.
Makes
Shah.
sense, Dr. Shah.
Yeah.
Makes
So,
sense.
folks, are there any more questions? If not, Sandeep, Varun, are you guys good? Any more questions? Or
I think I'm good, Vikram.
I'm good.
okay, cool.
I'm good.
Wonderful. I think this was a great open house session. Thanks for all the great questions. I think not just you folks, but several other potential partners will benefit from this. Thank you for all the questions.